Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's HPE HSS session. We're very excited to have you with us. Today, I'm pleased to introduce a wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Megan Seibel. She is the inaugural director of the Valor Program at Virginia Tech, which is dedicated to fostering leadership and capacity building for Virginia's largest private industries. She's also the associate director and co-founder for the Center for Cooperative Problem Solving at Virginia Tech, and is an associate fellow at the Occupational Research Center in the UK. Dr. Seibel, thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that intro, and hello, everybody. So today, as you are listening, feel free to drop things in the chat, raise your hand and ask questions. We can make it as interactive as you'd like. And hopefully there'll be some good questions. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, and there will be a couple little interactive components. But I just wanted to say thank you again for having me. I'm really excited. Obviously, it's always fun when you get to come in and talk about a topic that you're passionate about. I am, as director and co-founder of the Center for Cooperative Problem Solving, one of the global instructors for KAI practitioners around the globe. And we're actually in the middle of an international accreditation course this week. So this is great timing to spend some time with you. We're going to talk today about cognitive diversity in leadership teams, which we know is a big aspect of the work that we do. And if we think about all of the teams across Carillion in a system that is that large and that nuanced, there's different ways to sort of think through and frame that. It's based on adaptation innovation theory. So I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to listen to the lecture from this same time last year. That was sort of an overview of adaptation innovation theory and talks about our individual preferences when it comes to cognitive problem solving style. But there is a link to that, I know, so you're welcome to go back and listen to it. Today is going to go into some deeper applications for it, although will be pretty well standalone. So not necessary that you have listened to that prior to today. I'm hoping that today will take us into a broader space and thinking about implications for the work that we do and the teams that we're on. And then if you're interested, you can go back and backfill there. So I am curious, and I would just want you to think about a couple of things here, and then we're going to throw out a poll. But in the context of work, I want you to each think about yourselves as agents of change. Because as individuals who have the ability to ideate, the ability to execute, the ability to interact with others and operate independently, you each have the ability to be an agent of change in the space that you're in. And you really should value that about yourselves. But as individuals, we're also part of teams, or a team, single team, multiple teams, different kinds of teams. And the roles that we play on those teams can shift throughout the day. If we work on, one team that is very detail oriented in what it's addressing, and then another one, maybe a couple hours later, where we're thinking about some grand ideas of where we may go next, and the way that we operate on those teams may look and feel a little bit different as we move throughout time and space. So from the standpoint of asking you to think about that, I'm just curious about if you've ever worked to solve a problem with someone who has vastly different ideas than you do, was more or less concerned with the details than you might be, or seems to view guidelines or rules differently than you. And we're going to open up a poll, and you can take a quick minute if you have access to a keyboard or your phone and answer yes or no to each of these questions, and we'll see where everybody falls on that.
I think everybody's answered that's going to, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll.
So as suspected, the majority of people have worked with somebody who generates ideas, utilizes structures to implement those ideas, and responds to rules and group norms differently than you do. Some of us may have an opportunity to work with people who are pretty similar to us in these spaces on a regular basis, or in one or more areas. There's a difference, but for the most part, we've had a chance to be in situations where there's just something about the way the other person is operating that feels different than the way that you operate. And those differences are really natural because we're all each individuals, but those differences, depending on how well we manage them and how well we utilize them and how that difference is presented, right? That cognitive diversity, so to speak, is presented to the group. It can either be helpful, hopefully it's at best neutral, but it can also be hostile to the problem-solving environment. So it's a really interesting thing to kind of ponder. So I appreciate you answering those questions. So we've got 4 learning objectives for our time together today. To differentiate between adaptive and innovative preferences when it comes to generating ideas, utilizing structures, and responding to group norms. Related to the 3 questions we just answered, but I'll explain a little bit more about each of those areas in a moment. We're also going to compare agent of change groups within organizations and teams, and identify consensus groups and outliers. So like I mentioned before, each of you is an agent of change, but that then puts you in a different placement depending on the groups you're working with and inside of the large organization. We'll define precipitating events, pendulum of change, and spiral of change, since we know change is constant, but depending on how that change is happening and whether it's planned or unplanned, or how large or small that change is, it can really have a different impact on organizational response. And then also think about, in the end, just the value that we need to place on cognitive diversity as we lead and manage change. So just to start, I'll throw out some kind of leadership food for thought. I'm not going to belabor a lot of time on this slide, but these 4 areas of values, vision, communication, and trust are absolutely essential inside of any organization, and then the sub-teams within that organization, in order to really be able to navigate change well. We know we need to be able to interact with other people. None of us are going through any of these changes alone. And so the way in which we're executing and the way that each of these factors is driving the way that we're functioning and the way that our behavior is being executed and perceived by other people is really critical. So this is particularly important as we talk about some things. And I'll share with you today a couple of case examples of looking at some of the sub-teams inside of organizations, and think about how we might think about that then in the larger context of Carillion, for example, and where these things are so critically important. Just to throw up and be front and center are the institutional core values for both Carillion Clinic and the School of Medicine. So you'll see some overlap between these 2 lists. I tend to revisit these each time I have a chance to speak with you all, just to make sure that we keep those front and center, because just like those things that were so important in executing good leadership, you'll see some similar language in these that has to do with, at the end of the day, living out a vision, and based on the way that we're communicating and the amount of trust that we have, both amongst ourselves as professionals, but then also in that interface we have with the public that we serve, and being able to do that in an effective way and an efficient way, depending on how we define those. And that has a large part to do with our own cognitive preferences and how we are addressing and framing problems. So the cognitive function schema I'm going to share with you, this is based on the original work in adaptation innovation theory by Dr. Michael J. Curtin out of the UK. He passed away 2 years ago at the age of 94, but began this work in 1969 and had been studying it on beyond that. So this is a very simplified version of what goes on in our internal and external environments, but I just kind of want to throw it up for a placeholder. That sort of purple cloud at the top is the internal cognitive function that we each have. So cognitive affect and effect are in there, and then cognitive resource, where we store away things for learning. We know we've got potential level like IQ, for example, manifest level, which would be the accumulation of our education in there. And we've also got things that drive how we make decisions and the things that we value as we internalize aspects from our environment. In their cognitive effect section, though, it's also the way in which we prefer to do things. So for example, our environment, which could be the climate or the cultural policies and procedures that we have to deal with inside of an organization, or something that we're reacting to, some sort of a disaster or crisis, for example, that changes what it is that's happening. So these things happen in our environment around us. We internalize aspects of that in order to make use of them and then react to them via motive. And then that fosters our learning and what happens in there. The way that we generate ideas and think about how to utilize structural elements to implement our ideas as we're thinking about what to do with this information, how to respond to the problems that are part of that situation, for example, either by gathering more details and information or loosening things up so that we can go about it differently. is hardwired, and that is a big piece of cognitive effect. And then our behavior is the external piece of that we maybe show to the world and other people observe. And it may be in alignment with what our preferences are in thinking about how we're navigating these complex problem spaces, but it may also be a combination of our preferences and then what the situation is mandating of us or requiring of us, and the skill that we have developed over time that we can bring to the table in order to execute. So but the behavior is pretty flexible in that respect compared to our preferred style, which is stable over our lifetimes. So that's a big piece of it. Now, either as part of this conversation or beforehand, I am curious, and if people want to just drop in the chat, if you feel inclined to it, if I were to ask you how you define cognitive diversity, what might you share as in sort of a simple definition for cognitive diversity? I'm just going to move on, and if somebody adds something to the chat, we'll revisit it as we can. So we're going to take this idea that our cognitive problem solving style, our preferences for the way in which we go about doing things, not how well we do them, but the way in which we choose to do them, is actually a measurable thing. There is an assessment called the KAI, Current Adaptation Innovation Inventory, that people can access if you would like to. It also has a lot of face validity when we talk about it in teams. So when we're thinking about cognitive diversity, which people are defining as a range of preferences and abilities for processing information, yes, diversity of opinion and thought, the differences in the way people think through problems and craft solutions, the ability to adapt and integrate differences in styles and information, yes, all on point. And the way that you define those is a little bit of a mix of our style and our level. And so what I will share with you is that just when it comes to our style, the way in which we would like to execute, the way in which we generate ideas, utilize structures, and respond to rules and group norms, falls out on a continuum of very strong preferences for more adaptive ways of doing things, solving problems by making them better, so to speak. And I'll give you a little bit more descriptive language here in just a second, all the way to the other end of the continuum, where it's a very high or strong preference for innovation, where we are solving problems by making things different. Now, the reason I show you this graphic is because of all of the data points that we've collected over the last 40 years. It falls out on a normal curve. And 2/3 of the population fall within a standard deviation of the population mean. So that's where the majority of individuals are there, somewhere in the middle with a moderate preference. 96% then fall out within 2 standard deviations. So by the time people have very strong and more extreme preferences for adaptation and innovation, we're talking about very small percentages of the points of the population that then reside further outside of that than them. So they're potentially having to cope and work to close that gap unidirectionally in a lot of the things they do. And I'll set that up with you visually here with a couple of examples. But I just want to show you this continuum. Our preference for the way in which we do things is stable, but it will be relative then to the problem we're working on or the people we're working with, because those things then are probably going to be more adaptive or more innovative than us in any moment in time. But an aspect of the way in which we do things then gets magnified when we come to the table. And then we also bring with that some skill, some insight, some training, content expertise, institutional knowledge, positional power with a leadership role, for example. All of those things then influence the group dynamic, but can be maximized if we know really well what our style is and appreciate the cognitive style of those around us. So, as I moved my mouse, I went back. Apologies for that. So let's go on here and just talk about this more specifically. So for things that have to do just, for example, with what we call style of originality, or the way we generate ideas and prefer to generate ideas, people with a more adaptive preference will produce a sufficiency of ideas within an existing framework. They'll think about what we already have, what we already know, what we've tried before, and they'll have things that are on point and targeted. And because of that, when they think about those targeted ideas that they've probably thought through in their minds before they're expressed openly, they would expect a high rate of success of those ideas. They seem on point and on target within the structural elements that we're aware of. On the more innovative end, when it comes to idea generation, these individuals produce a proliferation of ideas, whether or not they're needed, and they may be more radical or tangential, which can also seem really exciting and glamorous. But because these ideas may or may not be totally related to what it is that we're trying to accomplish, there's some tolerance of failure of those ideas, because if a certain particular idea doesn't work, there's another idea where that one came from, and we can continue to try on some of those ideas and find something that works. But you can see how if we take just those two extreme examples, depending on what the situation is or the complexity of it, we may need a range of ideas so that we can pick something that's worth trying. The other next piece is what we call style of efficiency. So this is the way in which we utilize structures to get things done. And I'll challenge people when we talk about a word like efficiency, because some people have very specific visual of what efficiency means, but we can actually have more adaptive efficiency and more innovative efficiency. So on the more adaptive side, these individuals think about things like thoroughness and attention to detail, precision, methodical approaches when they're pulling together structural elements. What do we already have? What is in our inventory? Do we have our list? Are we fully prepared? Those kinds of things are in place so that they can use that and use those structural elements to improve something, to make it better, and they know where those starting points are, and it helps them get out of the gate because they have all the information they need up front. That makes them more efficient. On the more innovative side, where people think a little bit more tangentially and may approach a problem from unsuspected angles, will alter the structures or even disregard portions of the structural elements in order to do things differently. That dismantling, so to speak, helps them be more efficient. So that would be an innovative efficiency. But you can see pretty quickly how one group might view the other as problematic for them, because either to a more innovative person, the structure is going to feel constraining, where it's helpful to an adaptive individual, and to an adaptive individual, the looseness or lack of structure may feel daunting, where they would want more structure to be in place in order to execute. And then the third piece of each of us that contributes to our overall style is the way in which we respond to rules and group norms or group conformity. So more adaptive individuals will challenge the rules rarely. They typically will follow the rules and figure out what those rules and boundaries are before they begin. They're often, if they do change something, it will be with the support of a group consensus and are concerned more with group consensus before moving on. And they'll use the rules at the beginning and know what those structural elements are at the beginning in order to solve the problem. It may result in a change of policy or change of rule as an outcome, but that is the outcome of it. Where on the innovative side, in challenging rules and customs, maybe not worrying so much about consensus, these individuals will actually alter the rules at the front end in order to facilitate problem solving. And then they may be different again at the end, but they'll actually change it on the front end instead of on the back end. So there may be some shifting there. But depending on what we need, we're going to have some different reactions inside of the institution. So why does this matter? Like, does it really matter that everyone comes at it from a different perspective? And the short answer is yes, especially in really complex problems, because very often when we come to the table and we're trying to figure out how to navigate the change that's before us, we don't often put in all of the due diligence that helps us accept that the change is happening, understand fully what the change is, and knowing that each person has a different perception of that change, how necessary it is, how large it is, how minor it is, whatever that is, right? We have a different perception of the change at hand. We need to make sure that we take the time to agree on what the problem is, or problems, right? If it's a very complex problem, healthcare access, for example, or how we responded to a global pandemic, any of those things that are seemingly complex, service delivery, specializations, you name it, right? There's really complex things that we address on a normal basis, but there's sub problems and sub layers that go in there that offer a different complexity. So sometimes we think we're talking about the same thing, or we think we're talking about the same problem, but we're really on a slightly different page. And then after there's an agreement to the problem, we have to agree on how we're going to approach it and the structural or systematic or procedural things we're going to put into place in order to be able to solve it. And so people have to agree on the problem, and then agree on the structures that we're going to need or not need in order to solve it. And because we know each person views those pieces differently and is hardwired and carries this innate stability to think about those things differently, when we bring that diversity to the table, it can cause what we call problem B, because now all of a sudden there's a disagreement about approach, a disagreement about which idea to execute or try first, a disagreement between regarding maybe who needs to be involved or who doesn't need to be involved. And so figuring out where that lies around the table, knowing that we'll need a breadth of cognitive approaches to solve something really complex, but there may be more or less appropriate times to leverage it in different ways, is something that we need to consider so that we can navigate that space well. So there's a lot of implications for that. So I mentioned up front that we are all agents of change. And what I would like to throw out that is by each of you individually as human beings, being your own unique person, all people who problem solve and are creative, and you are all agents of change then as a result of that. By nature of being a human being, being able to ideate, being able to approach problems. That makes you an agent of change. Individuals at the same time then, as you yourself, the agent of change, we'll call that an agent of change 1, you as an individual, will contribute to team problem solving from a different place on that continuum. So if we take everybody in the group and map them on that continuum, there's different clusters of people, and I'll frame this in a little bit more detail, but what we'll call those the agent of change 2 or agent of change 3 groups. So at any point in time, you as an agent of change are part of one of these other subgroups in the team or in the organization. And that really influences how you are viewed and how you potentially feel like you can participate or be included in the situational spaces around which we're solving problems. More adaptive establishments, so if you think about kind of policy-driven, detail-oriented kinds of groups, are likely to anticipate what we would call a precipitating event, that next thing that's coming down the pike, the thing we need to be aware of, that are derived internally within the system. So if you think about strengths and weaknesses on a SWOT analysis, for example, those things that are internal to the system, they'll be able to see those, like a policy that needs to be revised so that we can make sure that somebody doesn't get harmed or we don't get have a lawsuit or something like that, right? There's something inside a strength or weakness within a system that needs to be addressed. More innovative establishments are more likely to detect precipitating events that emerge from outside of the system. So opportunities and threats that are on the horizon. And so we don't want to disregard people that are in these spaces. We really need them, right? We don't want to miss that next technology that we would like to have be part of the way that we do things so that we can remain competitive, for example, or knowing that something isn't going to work the way we anticipated. And so we want to make sure that we stop putting resources toward it before we have a chance to move on to something else. So opportunities and threats are external, strengths and weaknesses are internal. So we need individuals to be able to point those out. Those agent of change 2 and 3 groups can either complement each other's strengths if we know where people are positioned, and we have people who have the ability or authority to lead and manage across those boundaries. And they can cover up each other's weaknesses as a result of that and point out something or provide or offer a different level of cognitive diversity maybe than that the group itself has by being on the outside of that. But each of those subgroups, even though they may work really well with each other because they have similar styles, might quickly form in groups. And I'll show you where this could be problematic if you've got the power or authority inside of one of those subgroups versus collaborating with what they now perceive as the out group, right? We have a lot of social, inborn social kinds of things that we all navigate on a regular space where we've got in groups and out groups, right? People who are like me, people who are different than me, people who agree with me, people who don't agree with me. The policy that I can jive with, the policy that I disagree with, right? So we've got all of these things that we're navigating in those spaces on a regular basis. So determining where those change groups are, just to recap, agent of change 1 is you, individual, you can act as a leader. When we're looking across an entire group or organization, we can actually figure out where that midpoint is based on the mean of the group. The agent of change 2 group are people who are going to be within 10 points more adaptive or innovative either than an individual, or with the mean of the group. And so we'll talk here over the next couple of examples about what it looks like across a group, a team, an organization, where you've got this agent of change 2 group that's within 10 points of the mean. So there's a bulk of individuals there. And then the agent of change 3 groups, the more outlier groups, are going to be more than 10 points more adaptive or more innovative, and they're on the fringes then as a result. So graphically, let me just kind of show you what this looks like. Here's that continuum again. Like I said, there's this bipolar continuum with very strong preferences for adaptation at one end, very strong preferences for innovation at the other end, and then a normal curve in the middle. The numbers that I'll be using for this are based on the population samples that we have. So the population mean is a 95, just to give it a numeric static point. Now, just know that this could happen anywhere on the continuum, depending on where the group falls, but we'll also talk about implications for changes in leadership and what that means for them as well. So based on this population mean of 95, if you are each an agent of change, I apologize, every time I touch my mouse, it does its own thing. If you go 10 points plus or minus that 95, so between 85 and 105, that is what we would call the agent of change 2 group. So that's all these individuals in here. It's the majority of the group. It's about 40% of any group, that depending on how many people are in the group, but roughly 40%, because you're going 10 points on either side of the mean and based on the standard deviations and all the good stuff that we're not getting into today. That's where you've got the bulk of your people, right? The bulk of the people who may be ideating in similar fashion, may value structures and rules in the same way. Outside of that, then, more than 10 points more adaptive, we have our agent of change 3 outliers on the adaptive side, more than 10 points more innovative than the mean. We've got our agents of change group outliers on the innovative side. So like I said before, this is important because when we think about where we're looking for internal strengths and weaknesses or external opportunities and threats, before they are so emergent that it's too late to respond to them, we may want to make sure that we know who these individuals are so that we can leverage their input and make sure that we're aware of those kinds of things before they come down the pike. So I'm going to show you a way of mapping a group sort of numerically, and because it gives you a visual. This is actually a corporate event production company based out of Los Angeles that does, you know, light and sound for red carpet event type things that I worked with earlier this year. But I found it interesting because if you think about just the senior level people, and you could translate this to any company or corporation across the world, including something like Carillion, right, that has a head team. But in this one in particular, just in this internal working team, there was a range of 81 to 144, so moderately adaptive, or pretty moderate adaptive preference to a very, very high preference for innovation, to the point that on the more innovative end of that 144, you're talking about 0.5% of the population more innovative than this individual. That person also happens to be the company CEO and the person who the company is named after, right? So this is a reputation-based company whose brand identity is the CEO's name, and who now this person is also far more innovative in their preferences than the rest of the team. Behind him, then falling on down the line, he's got a president, his COO, account managers, event production people, senior producers, designers, on down. He had a suspicion that he knew that he was probably more innovative than the rest of the team. He didn't really know where they all fell when I came in to work with them. But what was interesting to me was the value that was placed on, even in this very seemingly creative and innovative space in which they work, the need for having those points there. So then when you plot them out on this piece and you can see where their range is, their mean is a 104.5. And this yellow highlighted here is the population mean of 95. So the mean of this group is slightly more innovative. Now, when you think about then for the 10-point range on either side of that, that is actually a half a standard deviation. So standard deviation is 18 points. And so if we take that and just kind of round it up to 20, that's where we get this plus or minus 10. So this 20-point chunk in the middle is where you would have a determination. And again, because I told you earlier, it can happen anywhere on the continuum, depending on where the group is. Let's just take this example. This team of people has a slightly more innovative mean. Their AC2 group is 10 points either side of that. So between 94.5 and 114.5. So that encompassed these 4 individuals in the middle. Then outside of that, then their more adaptive AC3s are these 2 individuals at this side, and the more innovative AC3s are the ones on the other end. And interestingly, in that group then is the company CEO, knowing that even though he may have these big, grand and different ideas about where things are going, he realizes the value in backfilling a team that has the ability to help put the structural elements in place and appreciate the details so that they can actually execute. Now, then you run into a challenge potentially, because the people who were required with execution are potentially the most adaptive AC3s on this team, who are having to take something that's coming from the most innovative person on the team and figure out a way to translate it such that they can execute. And so what happens then is you potentially have individuals in the middle of that gap, somewhere in the middle of this group, that would potentially have the opportunity to play the social role of bridger, for example, help translate back and forth, help make sure things get done. And so being really intentional about who's in those spaces to close the communication gap, but who also has the skill and willingness to do so, that they're well positioned inside of an organization to do that, so that you can have some opportunity to respect across those groups. I'm going to show you an example from a much larger group. So we'll just say this could be any larger group inside of Carillion, for example. It's a hypothetical group, but I wanted to show you what this looks like when you've got a broader range of individuals and more individuals in here, right? So this group has a range of 55 to 140 on the KAI, which I said you could actually take or do in-depth discussions about and have some face validity, so people could say, I have a pretty good idea that I have a moderately strong preference for adaption, for example, and people are pretty good at placing themselves. But if we look at what this means then when we're thinking about where to place people, in the middle then, this agent of change group between 85 and 105, again, is this bulk of individuals. There's an opportunity there for consensus, momentum, coming to agreement quickly. It's the majority of the group, and they may be operating similarly in the way in which they are idea generating or utilizing structures. You've got more adaptive AC3s, more innovative AC3s. And then what's interesting is thinking about where the positional leader is, because that's where we may have some power dynamic. If you have the person who has the authority to sign off on something, to say, let's move forward with this, let's not move forward with this, let's go ahead and deliver, or hey, I've got this great idea, what do you all think? And they happen to be situated in that primary AC2 group where the bulk of people around them also can add to that momentum and potentially agree to them, maybe because of the power dynamic, maybe because they actually are ideating, but it increases the opportunity for that. Then you can see that that would potentially have different implications. Then, for example, you've got your leader that is in the more adaptive, the more innovative agent of change group, and is saying, we need to do things differently. We need to do things faster. We don't need all of those details before we move forward. And they're calling the shots when the majority of other people in the organization are not necessarily on the same page with them at the same time. Or likewise, you've got a positional leader that has a more adaptive preference and is saying, let's think about that. Let's gather more information. Let's slow down. Let's put some more parameters around that. Let's make sure we've got all of our ducks in a row, and may potentially be so wedded to those systems that they miss an opportunity. Maybe that's better than moving too fast with something and not being fully prepared, but sometimes being overly prepared can slow us down as well. So what happens when we know that we need to value the voices at either end of that? We've got, like I said earlier, this need to close these gaps from one end to the other to make sure that all of these people feel like they are included and part of the organization. And it causes some coping where we know that we need to figure out how to communicate with somebody, no matter how much we express ourselves, it's not getting across, right? So maybe we have an adaptive preference and we've explained it and explained it and explained it, but it's in so much detail that somebody who doesn't need all of that detail just can't see it. It's right, they don't understand why all those trees are in the middle of the forest. And on the other end, maybe you're somebody who has a more innovative preference and you feel like you've explained it and explained it and explained it, but it's been in these big picture idea ways, and somebody who needs the concrete detail or needs the specificity can't see it. So then we've got to figure out a way to close these gaps. And that's where we may think about bridging, as far as where might the bridgers in an organization be. They're probably going to be in these gap spaces between agent of change groups. So the one that's between the more adaptive AC 2s and 3s may be able to translate kind of toward the middle there, vice versa on the other side. They may be able to navigate up and down that continuum, but they could become really important and valued people inside of that organization to help with the translatability of that, so that we can make sure that those ideas get heard and across. So any other thoughts on why you think, why is communication across a group so valuable? Does it really matter? I had somebody ask me one time why I bothered running a leadership program to teach people how to be leaders when we had other people that we could let make decisions for us. And I took a deep breath for a minute and thought, well, because I don't want everybody else making decisions for us. So I'm just curious, anybody want to answer that question? Go ahead, I see, yep.
I don't think I can answer that question, but I do have another question.
Sure.
This is a great visualization for what's going on, but in reality, we have groups that are skewed one way or another, so like if you have accountants, or that mentality, they might be more so in the adaptive than the evolutionary type mindset and communication, and that AC group is a little bit shifted. It's not really spread out and diversified. It's more hunkered in. There are going to be obviously variations inside that group.
Yep.
But, you'd expect some more differences. So I think this is kind of an idealized diagram.
It is idealized, and what I will share is then I think that's where, especially inside of large organizations that have multiple divisions or units, inside of those hierarchies where we have divisions and units, but now we're also thinking about power dynamics. We're thinking about content specific specializations, to your point. There are going to be different means within each of those sub-teams, but then each of those units or divisions will also then have their kind of consensus group and their own outliers within that group. So to give you an example, I worked with a manufacturing company last year, and they, as a group, all fell more innovative. And as a group, they were balanced. You could figure out where their primary consensus group was and where their outliers were. And so they said, well, are we a well-balanced team? And the answer is yes. In and of yourself, you are a well-balanced team. But if you look at your team overall, you are completely missing anybody with a strong preference for adaptation. So when it comes to rolling out a product or finding out what you're missing, asking someone if there is, could they review this thing and see what else we might need to add to it, it would probably be wise to then reach outside of your group and figure out how you can get that perspective that you're missing in, so that you can further delineate what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so that's where, that's like, again, ideal, right? We don't always have a chance to reach across divisions or reach outside of our particular units. But if we know where those style differences are, either in our own teams or with somebody that we can trust to do that, that would be a great thing. Sarah, I appreciate the comments you put in. And so my slides were going crazy a minute ago because I lost my mouse, and on a Mac, for some reason, the mouse wants to advance the slide. So you were talking about, and I just want to make sure I address all of this. Communication being vital, right? Making sure we're talking about the same problem. And depending on what the problem is, to your point, Francis, you may need somebody with a very specialized approach to address certain pieces of that problem. So maybe you have people who have a certain skill set who are working on one piece of the puzzle, a group with a different skill set working on a different piece of the puzzle. And then at some point, we're going to have to bring them together to make sure we have everything we need. Thinking about folks who can translate to those closer to the ends of the spectrum and how you might identify them is a really interesting piece, because they need to have not only the ability to do that and be positioned well, but also the interest in doing that. And so it may just be saying, hey, and so I'll give you an example, and it comes out of Virginia Tech. You all are affiliated with Virginia Tech, but years ago, and interestingly, I just heard President Sands reference recently some of the things that were being done when they were talking about the way they were going to change up doing majors and thinking about progress for the future. But years ago, when they first rolled that out with the former provost, and they had all of these working groups around campus to talk about what it meant, everybody was on a different enough page that about 3 months into the process, they said, it's been brought to our attention that this may be a little bit too vague and a little too fast, and we're going to slow it down and put some more parameters around it, because they knew it was something they really wanted to accomplish, but they weren't going to be able to accomplish it in that way and at that pace. So that's a big piece of it. But when you know that that's there, go ahead and call out and say, we're facing something we've never faced before. We know that there's going to take a lot of minds to do that. Who would be willing to step into those spaces, and who can do that? And that's easier to do in smaller teams, especially in more intact teams where people know each other and they already have some trust and ability to communicate. And I think that role, the people in those fringes, those bridging roles are absolutely critical, because if they're not there, then we may not be able to get the content or the ideas out of those fringe groups, and they may be talking amongst themselves. But if there's not a channel in place, something inside of the system that allows them to do that and offer that message forward, either via a person or via an anonymous comment box, then we may lose that, right? So what does that look like inside of an organization, and being mindful of that? So I'm going to show you just a couple of things where, hypothetically thinking, again, these are big populations based on the means, but I want to show you where we could have some problems, and then save some room for questions. So what we would call the cognitive climate of the organization, if you take that group where the bulk of the people reside, and then, like I said earlier, you now all of a sudden have the positional power inside of there too, that can very quickly determine the cognitive climate of an organization. It's the power of number and the power of status. And so it's really easy to get caught up in there, to make a lot of decisions, have some momentum, what seems like consensus, because people are agreeing with the power structures that are there, but it's pretty easy to accidentally miss the people on the outside of that, right? So if you have a gap, then the power of status now somehow is outside of that consensus group, then people may respond not so favorably, and you might have a shift in the organization. And I put this person on the more innovative end just because it matches an example that's coming, but this person of power could also be on the more adaptive end, and the shift goes the other way. But what happens then is you might have somebody that comes in, they want to change everything, right? And these could be leadership changes that are planned or unplanned, sudden, or they could, could be an election, for example, or it could be the sudden vacating of a senior's position inside of an organization and somebody else comes in. Maybe it's because we've gone through a rigorous interview process because somebody's retiring. And even though we've intentionally replaced them with this new individual operates very differently than the bulk of the organization does, or the bulk of the people that are there, right? So picture that in your mind. So if that person comes in and they start changing things, they're potentially going to push out people at the other end of that continuum. And with that, then you're losing institutional knowledge, content expertise, years of experience, and there's this shift. And it sets you up to have a pendulum swinging. I was in DC a couple of weeks ago for a meeting, and a woman who's the deputy agency director said, in her mind, when those pendulums shift, it's correlated with the amount of stress that the organization feels, or the people that are left to execute the job feel. So I'm going to give you a case example, different federal agency, but still a federal agency. This was their group broken out. I'm just going to put little figures in here. They have their AC2 group in the middle, AC3s on either side. Now, interestingly, the person who was in charge, their director, agency director, is this individual all the way over here on the far right. The day that I worked with them, she was getting ready to retire. So she left the following day. About 2 months later, another member of their team who had the most years of experience also left. And it was this individual on the innovative side. So they've now lost all of their AC3 innovators. And the new director, I hit that one too fast, is this woman over here on the more adaptive side. She'd been the deputy director who had been coping to communicate with this more adaptive, more innovative director all of those years, but had learned how to work well with her, even though they didn't see eye to eye on things. And now the new director is at the complete other end of that continuum. And everyone inside is going to have to think about how she communicates differently, how much more structured she might need, for example, in the reports she's receiving, or how much more structured she might be when she's giving direct feedback. Or doing annual evaluations, for example. And the entire mean of the group then shifts when there's a change in leadership potentially like that. So now there's internal shifting then of those groups inside where you've got the ability to have some consensus around change and what we're agreeing to. So that pendulum is tricky, and we might need to do something about it to try and stop it. So a devil's advocate could be an important person to have in an organization. You don't want somebody who's continually antagonistic and trying to rock the boat, but someone who's pushing the envelope just enough to say, have we thought about everything? What if? Let's speculate about, are we prepared for? Is sometimes a really important person to have on your team, where there's enough trust and respect that they can speak up and speak out without being penalized for that. Status of the originator is also an interesting thing to consider, and it goes a little bit with who conveys those messages back and forth and who feels like they have the ability to have their voice heard. Because if you have somebody that is not in a position of power or a position where they feel like they can share those ideas, there may need to be provisions in place for that. And then knowing that even though the new group in its formation, if there is a shift, has some advantages, it also loses some of the good things that were part of that old group. And we need to know where to stop that pendulum. So an alternative to that might be more of a spiral. So if you think about a pendulum is shifting back and forth, sometimes very fast, right? In these big seismic ways, sometimes as a slow moving ship. And by the time the change happens, we don't realize and it's too late. But a spiral has more upward and kind of outward momentum. It has a lot more to do with awareness of what the problem is, a tolerance for the change that's happening, and the ability that we know that we can support each other through that change, the ability to have enough understanding about what we're doing and buy-in that it allows us to collaborate. And then the success that comes with either something going really well and we want to replicate it, or something didn't go as planned, so we're going to learn from it and we're going to do that too. But each of those successes warrants a new level or a new layer of change, and the cycle begins again. So that's a nice way to kind of think about that. And then I'm just going to leave you with 4 thoughts that have to do with implications for groups and teams. To summarize, we'll open it up for some questions. But understanding your own preference for cognitive style, your hardwired stable preference, your cognitive problem solving style as an individual agent of change will allow you to better understand yourself, and then also other members of the groups that you're on, or what you can contribute to that group and how you might drive that. Intact teams may leverage individuals that are part of either those AC2 or AC3 groups in order to foster usable ideas and structures and gain consensus at the same time. So if we know we've got some consensus around the person who has the ability to sign off on it, for example, how can we make sure we bring some of the ideas forward from one of those out groups and incorporate it into the discussion where there's the ability to actually do something with it? Working across groups to maximize bridging and mitigate coping, it depends on communication, how well we work together, and how much trust we have. And those areas that I showed you earlier about idea generation, utilizing structures and rule and group norms are the indicators of communication, working together, and trust. And so if you're curious, you can really dig deeper and actually put some numeric values around each of those and figure out where there's maybe 2 people who have a similar overall score, but a gap internally to that total score, or 2 people who have a very different overall approach but have some proximity in one of those subcategories, and it gives them the ability to communicate or work more effectively together as a result of that. And then probably key to any of this is this idea that respect and compassion for one another is absolutely critical to the success of the team and the project. So I know it's a lot of information, in pretty quick succession. I want to make sure that we open it up to questions, and I'll probably, if I can stop touching my mouse, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can just have a dialogue as you'd like, or if we need to, we can go back and revisit some of the slides if that's helpful. But for now, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seibel. This was incredible information, super useful, and hearing lots of good comments in the background about how important all of this information you shared is. If you have questions, please feel free to take yourself off mute and ask those, or if you prefer, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that Dr. Seibel gets those and we can have some discussion. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
I'll be happy to kind of start us off here. As you were talking, I was thinking about different groups that I've been a part of, either in the work environment or in volunteer work, different capacities. Do you have any tips for people who find themselves at the ends of that spectrum? They're more adaptive and they end up in a team that's really innovative, or they're really innovative and they find themselves in a team that's, you know, more adaptive. Because that can be really exhausting to find yourself at either end of that spectrum. So any tips that you might be able to offer to folks?
Sure. Recognize that it's exhausting. And if you have a very strong preference one way or the other, you will probably the majority of the time be having to think about what it is like to operationalize that other direction. Where people in the middle, sometimes they'll say to me, well, I don't want to be average, or I don't want to be in the soggy gray middle, right? But they have the ability to flex a little bit more adeptly than somebody who has a very strong preference one way or the other. So just acknowledge how hard that is. What I will also tell people is know enough about yourself that it doesn't become somebody else's problem. I have a colleague who will say to me on a regular basis, oh, that's just because I'm so innovative. It's like, no, that is not an excuse to lay this stuff on other people because you don't feel like caring about the details, for example, right? I'm glad that you're innovative. Let's figure out what the good pieces are you bring to the table, but don't put that off on somebody else to figure out. If you can have some language, you know, say to somebody, I really appreciate details. I love information. I want to have as much at my fingertips as I can to feel successful in this. Please bear with me while I ask. Or somebody who says, you know what, I have the information that I need to get started. I really need some freedom to work on this. Give me a deadline because I need a deadline or I'm going to miss it. But I would like some space to work on this. And then I'm going to report back to you. Please stop micromanaging me, right? So you've got the ability to kind of have some language there. But that's usually enough to get the ball rolling on some of those things. So,
Thank
did
you.
that answer your questions here before we look at the chat?
Yeah, it sure did. Thank you very much.
All right, so somebody put in here, I've participated in several personality assessment type tests such as DISC and wondering which of those might best emphasize adaptive versus innovative continuum. Okay, interesting. So if you ever want to be lulled to sleep with the statistics in the manual, I will tell you that KAI in the way that it was based on adaptation innovation theory as an actual assessment that organizations will use very often for professional development, measures with purity this piece of cognitive effect we've been talking about. Because it does that and only that, it's actually not correlated with very many other things that are on the market. One, because it's stable, it's not flexible, right? So there's a lot of things out there like emotional intelligence, where it's a great measure, but it tells you what about you that you can adjust over time. Or some that are a little bit mixed. So there's a small level amount of correlation between certain pieces of Myers-Briggs, for example, extroversion, introversion, sensing, perceiving, judging, perceiving, and sensing intuition. But there's not a correlation with thinking, feeling, because that actually is in cognitive affect, and this measures cognitive effect. So it's a great question. It's not duplicative of the other pieces that are out there, but we know that personality is really complex. So if you have the ability to take some different assessments or be part of that, they will give you different little snapshots of who you are. Most of the practitioners we have around the world, if they have to come back to two because of the stability and the impact for team dynamics, they'll typically go with Myers-Briggs and the KAI, although DISC is used broadly, and we're trying to figure out if there's any overlap between parts of the DISC and KAI. And then the Gallup Strengths Finder is another one where there's a lot of interest in what that looks like. And since Virginia Tech is a strengths campus, and anybody with a Virginia Tech PID can take the strengths for free, which I would assume would go with some of our Coalian employees as well, although we'll have to look into that. There may be the way in which we leverage our strengths may be interesting compared to being more adaptive or more innovative in our execution. So great question. Hopefully that answered it. If it didn't, drop that in the chat. And then someone wrote, I'm sorry if you mentioned this and I missed it, but there's a quiz you can take to find out. The answer is yes. Obviously, this is not, the presentation is not meant to be a sales pitch, but we do have access to it. And what I will say is, the center that we started at Virginia Tech is partnering with the KAI Foundation in the UK. And right now we are the global hub for all practitioner accreditation around the world. And we very often will offer it to different client groups and people that use it. And inside of Virginia Tech, we have the ability to do that at a different kind of access point than an external consultant might do that as well. So yes, if that's something you're interested in, I would suggest you get with the training division at Carillion, and we'll figure out what that might look like. But you're also welcome to email me directly. Anyone can buy a code. I'll just throw that out there. They're reasonably priced and less expensive than some of the other things, but we can chat about that offline.
Dr. Seibel, I do have another question for you. As I was listening to you go through your presentation, I was just curious, do folks who are more innovative or folks who are more adaptive use particular language when they're writing or talking about their needs for information or the ways that they communicate? Has there been anything that has looked at language usage depending on where you might be on that spectrum?
I would say language usage, and then even just the way that they'll describe something or the way that they think they've offered enough detail to things. So sometimes we'll have people who have a very innovative preference, for example, who will try and put down the parameters for something. So they might, they'll write out the expectations for something or the directions for something. And to them, it makes a ton of sense because in their mind, they know where they're going, but it seems really vague or lacking the specifics that somebody that has a more adaptive preference needs. Where on the other hand, if you're talking about writing out things that would be something where people would have to compare a deliverable to it, or are we meeting the expectations, and it's written in a very detailed and adaptive way, that can feel really constraining to people on the other end of it because they just kind of feel hogtied by that. So what we'll say is sometimes there needs to be that variation. I know students, for example, who were faced with an assignment, right? And so if someone has a thing and they say, this is what you need to do, and here's the rubric. And if you think about, even like med school environment or whatever it is, here, do this, 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 and this, and this in order to get an A. For somebody who likes that, perfect, they can execute on that. If you were to say to the same person, just write about what you're learning, it just is like, they don't, where do you even start with something like that, right? So, so there will be some words, more detailed or vague kinds of language and sentence structure. What you'll also see is like those structural pieces. How much is in each paragraph, how much loaded is each sentence, those kinds of things too. But I'm not sure anybody's actually gone through and broken down all of the linguistic pieces of it, but there's definitely, you can get a kind of a style difference and then even an expectation difference for what people are looking for if somebody else has to do something with that piece that they've written.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so we have just 1 minute. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or put your question in the chat. We'll make sure Dr. Seibel sees that.
Thank you all so much for giving me an hour of your time today.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate your attendance. If you would like to get CME credit, Deb has put the CME link in the chat for you. And also please feel free to go back and watch the previous session about a year ago, I think it was, and we've put that link in the chat for you as well, where Dr. Seibel presented the first part of this particular piece of information. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope you have a great day. Look forward to seeing you at our next session.